He wasn't supposed to be in that bed. That's the first thing Aziel Beaumont thought when the elevator doors opened on the 43rd floor of Northwestern Memorial's private wing. Not he can't be gone. Not this isn't real. Just he wasn't supposed to be in that bed. Orion Valsieri, the Triplet Alpha King. The man whose name alone could stop a room. Lying flat on his back, chest barely rising, tubes running in and out of him like the hospital was trying to hold his body together with wire and prayer. And it wasn't working. The neurologist had already said the word. Brain dead. Said it the way people say unfortunately before they ruin your life, calm, clinical, like the syllables didn't have weight. Like the man in that bed hadn't kissed Aziel's temple 3 mornings ago and whispered something low and private against his hair. Aziel walked past the doctor, past the brothers, past the 2 security guards who stepped forward and then stepped back when Calum Valsieri lifted one finger. He walked straight to the bed, pulled back the sterile blanket, and climbed in. Nobody stopped him. That probably said more about how broken the room was than anything else. Hi viewers. Have you ever felt in your body that someone wasn't gone, even when everyone around you had already let them go? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. He pressed his ear to Orion's chest. The heart monitor said what it always said. Steady. Mechanical. Not alive, just not stopped yet. There's a difference. Aziel knew that difference. He'd learned it on the south side at 17, crouched over strangers in parking lots, pressing his hands to wounds and counting. He knew what a body felt like when it was leaving. This wasn't that. Orion's chest was warm. Not warm the way a heated blanket makes you warm. Warm the way a person is warm when something inside them is still running, still moving, still deciding. Aziel pressed his palm flat over Orion's sternum. I know you're in there, he said. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just fact. Behind him, he heard one of the brothers shift. He didn't turn around. He'd learn their tells later. Right now, the only person in this room that mattered was the one who couldn't speak. The neurologist cleared his throat. Mr. Beaumont. I understand this is extremely difficult. But the scans are conclusive. There is no higher brain function. What you're feeling, the warmth, the chest movement, that's the ventilator. That's machinery. Not him. Aziel didn't move. We have a protocol for these situations, the doctor continued, and the family has been informed of the timeline. I'm not family, Aziel said. Silence. I'm his mate. He turned his head just enough to make eye contact with the neurologist. And I didn't ask you to explain anything to me. He felt the doctor leave. Heard the soft click of dress shoes pulling back toward the doorway. Heard the brothers exchanging something low and wordless. The kind of communication that lived between people who'd grown up reading each other. Aziel turned back to Orion's face. He looked different without the command in his expression. Softer. Younger. Like the version of himself he only showed in the dark, in private, when it was just the 2 of them and the city spread out 40 floors below like it belonged to them. Maybe it still did. Aziel studied him the way you study something precious that someone is telling you is already gone. The line of his jaw. The stillness of his mouth. The faint trace of a scar that ran along the left side of his chin. The one Orion had never explained and Aziel had never pushed on. He'd always figured there would be time for that story later. He was still counting on later. He pressed his lips to Orion's temple and stayed there. 1 breath. 2. He was on the 3rd when he saw it. It was so small he almost convinced himself he imagined it. A single tear. 1 thin line tracking down from Orion's closed eye, sliding along the curve of his cheekbone, disappearing into the white pillow beneath him. Aziel pulled back. He looked at the face. Still. Unmoving. The machines kept their steady rhythm. Nothing changed. But that tear was there. Still wet. Still real. The room felt different after that. Not louder. Sharper. Like something in the air had shifted an inch to the left and everything was now slightly out of its expected position. Aziel looked at the tear and thought about what it takes to produce one. The mechanics of it. Grief counselors called it autonomic. Doctors called it drainage. He called it proof. Aziel didn't call anyone over. Didn't shout. Didn't point at it with shaking hands. He just looked at it the way you look at evidence before you decide what to do with it. Quiet, careful. He reached up and pressed 2 fingers gently against Orion's cheek, right over the track the tear had left. Still warm, still deciding. And then the heart monitor did something. 1 spike, sharp, quick, gone before anyone could blink. The attending nurse jolted forward, eyes on the screen. The neurologist turned back from the doorway. Calum Valsieri stood up from his chair by the window for the first time since Aziel had entered the room. Everybody looked at the monitor. The line returned to its flat, even rhythm. Aziel kept his eyes on Orion's face. Not the monitor, not the brothers, not the doctor moving back across the room with his clipboard and his certainty. He watched Orion's face because he knew, the way you know things that have no scientific name, that the answer was not going to come from a machine. It was going to come from the man. The neurologist stepped in, checked the readout, and said the 4 words that would keep Aziel awake for the next 72 hours. Calm, unbothered, already moving toward the door again. Residual nerve discharge. Nothing significant. And he left. Aziel stared at the monitor long after the spike was gone. His hand was still on Orion's chest. His heart was still running faster than any machine in this room. He thought about every person he'd ever watched be dismissed. Every Southside patient who waited 6 hours and got 3 minutes. Every time the system looked at someone without power and decided the looking wasn't worth the time. He'd spent years being angry about that in the abstract. Now it was sitting in front of him wearing the face of the man he loved, and the anger wasn't abstract anymore. It was something else entirely. It was a decision. The withdrawal was scheduled for Thursday. For days. That's what Aziel heard when the door to the consultation room opened and Calum's voice carried through the gap. Flat, controlled. The way men sound when they've already decided and are just going through the steps. For days. And then they would turn off the machine that was keeping Orion's chest moving, and the hospital would call it a natural conclusion, and the Valsieri Empire would have a funeral, and Aziel would. He stopped that thought before it finished. He was still in the bed. Nobody had made him leave. That surprised him more than he wanted to admit. He'd expected to be dragged out by security within the first hour. Escorted downstairs, handed his jacket, maybe offered a pamphlet about grief counseling. He'd braced for it, prepared his argument. He'd been thrown out of places with more resources than this. But the order never came, which meant either Calum was softer than he showed, or Calum was calculating something Aziel couldn't see yet. Either way, he wasn't leaving. He pressed his mouth against the top of Orion's shoulder. "I met you in November," he said. Quiet. Like they were alone even though he knew someone was probably watching through the glass panel in the door. "You walked into a community clinic on Kedzie that smelled like antiseptic and old radiators, and you had on a coat that cost more than the clinic's monthly rent." He exhaled. "And you sat down next to a woman waiting for her blood pressure results, and you asked her how long she'd been waiting, and she said 3 hours, and you didn't say a word. You just sat there with her until her name was called." That was the part Orion never talked about. Aziel had watched the whole thing from the intake desk, expecting him to pull out a phone or make a call or get bored the way men like him always got bored. He didn't. He just sat with her. Aziel had been suspicious for a full 3 weeks after that. He pressed his palm flat to Orion's chest again. "You were different. I kept waiting to find out you weren't. I kept looking for the version of you that matched what I knew about men who came from where you came from." He paused. "I'm still waiting." The room held that. Morning light was starting to come through the tall windows. The gray, reluctant kind that Chicago gets in late November, when the sky can't fully commit to brightness. It caught the edge of the four-stand, the chrome rail of the bed, the small vase of white flowers someone had placed on the windowsill. Aziel didn't know who'd brought those flowers. Probably one of the brothers, or staff following protocol. Either way, they felt wrong in the room. Too decorative. Like someone had already started staging this space for its next purpose. He thought about moving them. He didn't. Instead, he kept talking because talking was the only thing that felt like contact right now. His voice against Orion's chest. Sound traveling through skin. It might mean nothing medically. It meant everything to him. You remember the second time we saw each other? He wasn't really asking. You came back to the clinic 3 weeks later. Didn't need anything. Didn't have an appointment. You walked in and handed the front desk woman a card and said you were making a donation and she didn't know what to do with you. He almost smiled. I didn't either. That second visit had changed things. Not because of the money. Aziel had learned early not to let money rewrite his read on a person. But because Orion had looked across the waiting room and found Aziel immediately. Like he'd come back specifically to see where he was. Like he'd spent 3 weeks deciding whether to. And that kind of intention, slow, considered, certain, was harder to dismiss than any grand gesture. The monitor held its rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Footsteps. 2 sets. Moving fast. Aziel didn't look up. He caught pieces of what they were saying through the thin wall. Not words exactly, just tone. Urgency wrapped around something formal. He'd spent enough years working in under-resourced spaces to know what hushed conversations between people with authority sounded like when they didn't want anyone to hear them. Board pressure. That was the phrase that broke through. He heard it clearly. Distinct. Board pressure. Then the footsteps moved on and the hallway went quiet again. Aziel stayed still. Let it settle. Board pressure. That meant this decision, 4 days withdrawal conclusion, wasn't just coming from the family. There was something external pushing on this. Something institutional. Something with a financial interest in how this ended. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where institutions made decisions over people's heads all the time. Where the timeline on someone's life got accelerated by forces that had nothing to do with that person's actual condition. He knew what it looked like from the inside. He just never expected to be sitting inside it wearing this particular kind of grief. He reached for the chart. He knew he wasn't supposed to. He knew exactly what the protocol was. He'd worked in enough clinics to understand that flipping through a patient's chart without clearance was the kind of thing that ended your access permanently. He flipped through it anyway. He was looking for the neurological assessment. The one that gave the brain death classification. The one that started the clock on Thursday. He found it, read through it, and stopped. The timestamp on the initial assessment was wrong. Not wrong in a way that was obvious. Not a typo. But the secondary scan, the one that was supposed to confirm the first, was logged 4 hours before Orion was even admitted to the ICU. 4 hours earlier. Aziel looked at the page. Then at Orion. Then back at the page. His mouth went dry. He folded the page number into his memory and put the chart back exactly where it was. 4 hours before admittance. Someone had already decided before they ran the test. He confronted the neurologist at 6 in the morning. Not in the hallway. Not with witnesses. In the consultation room at the end of the corridor, where the doctor had gone to make a phone call, and Aziel had followed him there and pushed the door open and said, "The timestamp on the secondary scan is wrong." The doctor turned around slowly. He was a tall man, silver-haired. The kind of physician who'd been in prestigious rooms long enough to treat everyone who hadn't as background noise. He looked at Aziel the way certain people look at a fire alarm, mildly irritated, already deciding it's a false trigger. "Mr. Beaumont." The secondary neurological scan was logged 4 hours before admittance, Aziel said. "Walk me through how that's possible." A pause. Clerical errors occur in high-pressure intake scenarios. The digital system sometimes. "The system logs automatically at point of entry," Aziel said. "I've worked in clinical intake for 6 years. That's not a clerical error. That's a sequencing impossibility." The doctor set his phone down. "You need to understand that grief. Don't." 1 word. Flat. Aziel didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Don't use grief to explain away a documentation error in a brain death classification. That's not grief. That's a question. And I want an answer. The silence between them had weight. The doctor looked at him for 3 full seconds. Not the way you look at someone you're going to help. The way you look at someone you're calculating. Aziel recognized it. He'd seen that particular look in a lot of offices, behind a lot of desks, worn by a lot of people who'd decided the conversation was already over before it started. Then the doctor said, quietly but firmly, I'd recommend you speak with the family's legal counsel before making any further accusations. He picked his phone back up. Conversation over. Aziel walked out. In the hallway, 2 security personnel were already moving toward him. He recognized the shift. Someone had been watching. Someone had made a call. He kept his pace even unhurried, already calculating his next move before they reached him. He didn't have to calculate for long. Calum Valsieri appeared at the junction of the corridor. Tall, dark, identical to Orion in structure but entirely different in presence, harder, colder, every movement accounted for. He looked at the guards, looked at Aziel. "Walk with me," Calum said. It wasn't a request. They moved to a small family lounge. Calum closed the door and stood by the window overlooking the city. The morning light was gray and flat. Chicago in late autumn. Everything looked like it was waiting for permission to change. "You're going to get yourself removed from this floor," Calum said. "Then remove me." Calum looked at him. "That's not what I want." Aziel said nothing. Calum was quiet for a moment. He turned his glass of water in his hand slowly. Not drinking it, just moving it the way people do when they're organizing a thought they haven't finished. Aziel watched him and waited. "My brother." Calum stopped. Something moved through his face and then left. He was practiced at that, controlling what showed. "Orion made a choice when he brought you into this. That choice has weight. I'm not dismissing it." He turned to face the window. "But you pushing on medical staff at 6 in the morning is going to create a situation we can't manage quietly." "I'm not interested in quiet," Aziel said. "I know." Calum glanced at him sideways. "That's what concerns me." Aziel crossed his arms. He thought about what it cost Calum to say that much. Men like him didn't admit concern easily. They named it as strategy or risk or complication, but not concern. The word alone told him something. He thought about telling Calum what he'd found. The timestamp, the sequencing error. He opened his mouth and stopped, because Calum's face, right now in this light, was composed in a way that Aziel couldn't read. And in his experience, when powerful men were unreadable during a crisis, it didn't mean they were neutral. It meant they were already playing something. He closed his mouth. "I want to stay with him," Aziel said instead. Calum gave him one slow nod. "You can stay." A pause. "For now." They walked back to the room in silence. The hallway felt different than it had an hour ago. Smaller, like the walls had moved an inch closer while they weren't looking. Aziel kept his face forward, watching the room number get closer, thinking about every piece of information he was choosing to hold back and exactly how long he could afford to hold it. Orion was exactly as they'd left him. Machine steady, face still. The city grinding on 43 floors below. Aziel sat in the chair beside the bed and took Orion's hand. He started talking, low, unhurried, about the broken radiator in their apartment on the north side that they'd been arguing with the building super about for 2 months. About a recipe he'd started learning from Orion's housekeeper. Some kind of slow-cooked thing with short ribs that he'd burned on the second attempt and gotten almost right on the third. About the way the light came in crooked every morning through the east window, splitting across the floor in a way that hit Orion's side of the bed first, and how Orion had complained about it exactly once and then never again, like he'd made peace with the intrusion. He was talking about nothing. He was talking because he needed Orion to hear something real in this room full of clinical language and monitored silence. He felt it when he was mid-sentence. A twitch. Right hand. Index finger. One small, tight curl. Gone in half a second. Aziel didn't move. Didn't breathe. Stared at the hand. The doctor's voice came back to him already. Involuntary reflex, no clinical significance. Nothing that changes the assessment. He could hear it before he'd even told anyone. He looked at the hand for a long time. Then he pulled up the hospital's public records on his phone and searched the ownership registry for Northwestern Memorial's private care wing. 3 clicks in, he found it. A biotech subsidiary named Valsieri Medcorp Holdings had a 34% stake in the management group that ran this floor. He read it again, slowly. Then he put his phone face down on his knee and looked at Orion. The machine kept breathing for him. And somewhere in this building, Someone with a financial interest in Orion Valkyrie's death had already written the timeline. Aziel pressed his thumb against the inside of Orion's wrist, not checking his pulse, just holding the place where a pulse was, just making contact with the part of him that was still undeniably alive. "I found it," he said, too quiet for anyone else to catch. "I know what this is." He didn't say the rest. Not out loud. Not yet. But the rest was, and I'm not going to let them finish it. 3 weeks before the shooting, Orion had told him something in the dark. It was past midnight. The city was quiet in the particular way it gets when weather is coming, that thick, held-breath stillness before the temperature drops. Orion was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, and Aziel was half asleep against his shoulder when Orion said, "I'm going to pull the investments." Aziel had opened his eyes. Which investments? It wasn't a question. The way Orion said it, low, deliberate, like a man reading from a list he'd been carrying for a long time, meant he wasn't talking about something small. "MedCorp," Orion said. "The whole subsidiary. The private care wing deals, the rehab facility contracts, the research funding arrangements." He exhaled. "All of it." Aziel had sat up. "Orion, it's wrong. Simple as that. No performance, no lengthy explanation. The return model is built on extended care timelines, which means the company profits when patients stay sicker longer. I've been reviewing the internal structures for 8 months. He turned his head and looked at Aziel in the dark. 8 months. And every time I tried to bring it to the board, the agenda got reshuffled. Aziel had felt something cold move through him. Does your family know? A pause. They know I've been looking at the financials. He turned back to the ceiling. They don't know what I found. Aziel had asked him why he hadn't told them. Orion had been quiet for a long time before he answered. When he did, it wasn't what Aziel expected. Because I don't know yet which of them already knew. That sentence had sat in the room like a third person. Neither of them moved after it. Aziel had lain back down against Orion's shoulder and stared at the same ceiling and thought about what it meant to build something with your brothers your entire life and then reach a point where you couldn't be sure of them. He hadn't known what to say. He still didn't. Now Aziel sat in that ICU room and let the memory settle over him like a second blanket, heavier than the first one, the kind of weight that changes your breathing. The shooting had been called a rival gang attack. That was the story the external news picked up within hours. 2 sentences, attributed to unnamed law enforcement sources. Aziel had read it on his phone in the waiting room while someone handed him a cup of water he never drank. Rival gang attack. He didn't believe it then. He believed it even less now. He thought about the argument they'd had the morning before it happened. He'd pushed back, not on the reform itself, but on the pace. You're moving too fast. You don't know who in that room is already covering their position. Orion had looked at him with that expression he used when he was listening and disagreeing at the same time. Patient. Certain. I have documentation, Orion had said. Enough to make it impossible to bury. Aziel hadn't asked what that meant exactly. He wished now that he had. He thought about that morning. The way Orion had moved through the apartment. Deliberate, collected, like a man who'd made a decision and was carrying it with both hands. He'd made coffee and left Aziel's cup on the counter with the handle turned the way he knew Aziel preferred. He'd checked his phone twice. He'd looked at Aziel across the kitchen and said, quietly, "Whatever happens today, you know where I stand." Aziel had thought it was about the board meeting. He hadn't asked what else it might have meant. He pulled out his phone and opened Orion's shared cloud. The one Orion had added him to 6 months ago. Casually, like it was a minor thing, like handing someone a key to a room they'd live in for years without knowing it yet. He'd accessed it twice before. Once to pull a restaurant reservation, once to find a contact number. He scrolled now without a specific destination. He was 3 folders deep when he found it. A file. Scheduled send. Encrypted. Set to release automatically in 30 days from the date stamp, which meant it would go out in 27 days from today. He stared at the file name. It was just a number string. No label. He didn't open it. Not yet. He didn't have the decryption access, and even if he did, He understood enough about what Orion had been building to know that moving the wrong piece too fast could collapse the whole thing. Whatever Orion had set up, whatever system he'd built around this file, this timer, this evidence, it had been designed carefully. By a man who knew the people he was documenting. By a man who didn't trust the room. 27 days. He looked at the scheduled withdrawal date. Thursday was in 4 days. His jaw tightened. 4 days against 27. He did not have the luxury of letting this play out at the pace Orion had designed for. He needed to find a way to hold the space, hold the timeline, hold this room, for 23 more days than the hospital was currently planning to give him. He locked the phone. He thought about Calum, about the composed, unreadable face in the gray morning light, about the way powerful men held information like currency, spending it only when the return was certain. He thought about showing Calum this file. And then he thought about the 34% ownership stake, and the timestamp, and the board pressure, and Orion's voice in the dark. I don't know yet which of them already knew. He put the phone in his pocket. Not yet. He wasn't ready to hand this to anyone whose position he couldn't confirm. He pressed Orion's hand between both of his and leaned in close, his voice barely above a breath. 27 days, he said. You just have to make it 27 days. The machine kept its rhythm. The city moved 43 floors below. And somewhere in a cloud file with a number for a name, a dead man's evidence waited to tell the truth. By Tuesday, they were calling him delusional. Not to his face. That's not how it works when power wants to move you without touching you. It was in the phrasing of the hospital's official statement. Non-family member in emotional distress, extended grief response. And in the way the attending nurses shifted their eye contact when he spoke, like looking at him directly required a decision they hadn't been authorized to make. It was on the internet by noon. He found it when a notification came through on his phone. Someone had tagged him in a comment thread. He didn't want to look. He looked anyway. Lil Pookie crying on a dead man's chest. That was the phrase someone used. It spread the way certain things spread online. Fast, flat, carried more by mockery than by any actual interest in what was true. By 3 in the afternoon it had a hashtag. People who had never been inside a hospital, never held someone's hand through a monitor alarm, never felt the particular terror of knowing something that no one around you would confirm. Those people had opinions about Aziel Beaumont's grief. He turned his phone over. He understood what was happening. This was not an accident. The story hadn't leaked itself. Someone had fed it. Someone had given a reporter or a blogger or a comment section regular just enough detail to be credible, then let the machinery of public opinion do the rest. Label him hysterical. Label him delusional. Get the crowd laughing before he could say anything worth hearing. It was clean. It was effective. And it made him angrier than anything else that had happened in the last 3 days. He picked up the printed copy of Orion's legal reform proposals. The full draft, 43 pages, that he'd pulled from the cloud drive and printed at the nurse's station that morning while the overnight attendant was on a break, and he started reading it out loud. Not because he thought Orion could hear him in any way the doctors would accept. Because the alternative was silence, and silence in that room felt like surrender. Section 4. He read, keeping his voice even. Current investment structures within private care subsidiaries create systemic incentive misalignment between patient outcome and revenue generation. He paused, looked at Orion's face. You wrote this yourself. You know how much I had to learn just to understand what that sentence means. He kept reading, page after page. The language was dense in places legal, financial, technical. Orion had clearly worked on this for a long time. The margins had handwritten notes in his tight, precise script. Cross-references, questions to himself. Sections marked with a single asterisk that Aziel took to mean, come back to this. He read those sections twice. He was on page 12 when the door opened and one of Orion's brothers, the third one, Zephyr, the quietest of the three, came in without announcing himself. He stood just inside the doorway and looked at Aziel the way you look at a problem you haven't classified yet. They're moving up the timeline, Zephyr said. Aziel set the pages down. To when? Wednesday morning. 6 a.m. 1 day earlier. One less day. He held the information in his chest for 3 seconds. Let it settle. Let it become real. Then he breathed through it because falling apart was not a thing he could afford right now, and he knew it. I requested an independent neurologist 2 days ago. I was told it was being processed. Zephyr's expression didn't change. It was declined. On what grounds? A pause. Family authorization is required for external specialist consult. The request has to come through us. Aziel looked at him. He understood what Zephyr was telling him. And he understood just as clearly what Zephyr was not offering to do about it. He thought about asking directly. Just say it, authorize the consult. Give me the one thing that could change the clinical picture before Wednesday morning. He thought about saying it plainly, without strategy, just one human being asking another for help. He looked at Zephyr's face and understood that plainness was not going to work here. Something in Zephyr's stillness, the particular quality of his silence, told Aziel that this man was not opposed to the consult. He was also not going to be the one to call for it. Whatever was happening between the brothers, whatever agreement or tension or unspoken arrangement existed in the Valkyrie structure right now, Zephyr had placed himself exactly at its edge. Close enough to watch, far enough to deny. Aziel stood up. He walked to the small desk in the corner of the room, opened his phone, and pulled up the Illinois Department of Public Health Oversight portal. The one that allowed external parties to file a formal complaint regarding medical protocol compliance in licensed facilities. He'd found it at 2 in the morning 2 days ago. He'd read the full intake process. He knew exactly what he needed to submit. He started filling out the form. Zephyr was still in the room. You understand what that does? Zephyr said. It wasn't a question. It opens an external review. Aziel didn't look up from the screen. Which means the hospital is required to pause any irreversible procedures pending compliance assessment. Silence. It also means this becomes public. It's already public. He thought about the hashtag. About Lil Pookie. I didn't choose that. He submitted the form. Confirmation number came back in 40 seconds. He screenshot it, emailed it to himself, saved it to the cloud drive, and put his phone in his pocket. He walked back to the chair beside Orion's bed and sat down. He was shaking. He didn't let it show. He pressed both hands flat on his thighs and breathed through his nose. Slow and even, the way he'd learned to breathe in emergency situations when the body wanted to panic and the work required something steadier. Power rarely silences you with force. He understood that now in his body, not just his mind. It convinces everyone around you that you're hysterical. It lets the room do the work. It turns your grief into a liability and your certainty into a symptom, and then sits back and watches you discredit yourself. He was not going to discredit himself. He looked at Orion's face. They blocked the independent neurologist, he said quiet. So I went over the hospital. The machine breathed. I know you would have done the same thing. He picked the reform proposal back up and found his page. He kept reading. He read for 2 more hours. He read until his voice was low and rough and the words on the page had started to blur at the edges. He read until the afternoon shift change happened in the hallway and new footsteps took the place of old ones and the light through the tall windows went from gray to the thin gold of late afternoon. He read because the document was Orion's voice when Orion had no voice. He read because 43 pages of careful, considered expensive truth deserved to be heard out loud in the room where the man who wrote it was still, somehow, deciding whether to come back. And down the hall, in an administrative office that had probably never dealt with an external state complaint filed by an Omega mate of a hospitalized Alpha King, someone's phone was ringing. And whoever picked it up was going to have a very different Tuesday than they'd planned. And Wednesday was coming. And Aziel Beaumont was not going anywhere. They arrived at 9:17 Wednesday morning. 2 of them, both in state-issued lanyards, one carrying a tablet, the other a hard-sided briefcase that she set on the nurse's station counter without asking permission. The woman with the briefcase introduced herself as Dr. Renata Osei, Independent Compliance Officer, Illinois Department of Public Health. The man beside her was a legal attaché named Marcus Tillman whose job, as far as Aziel could tell, was to stand near things and make them feel official. The floor went quiet the way floors go quiet when authority that nobody arranged walks in through the front door. Aziel watched from the doorway of Orion's room. He'd filed the complaint at 3:17 Tuesday afternoon. Less than 18 hours ago. He hadn't expected a response this fast. In his experience, years of advocating for patients in under-resourced clinics, years of pushing on systems that preferred not to be pushed, 18 hours was record time, which told him one of two things. Either the complaint had flagged something already on the department's radar, or someone with leverage had made a call. Either way, they were here. Dr. Osei moved through the floor with the particular kind of calm that comes from having walked into resistant institutions for long enough that the resistance no longer registers as personal. She spoke to the charge nurse. She spoke to the hospital administrator, who materialized from a back office within 4 minutes looking like a man who had just remembered something he'd rather forget. She asked for the full neurological file on Orion Valsieri, including all scan timestamps, all attending physician notes, and the internal documentation of the withdrawal timeline. The administrator said he'd need to confirm with legal. Dr. Osei said she'd wait. She said it the way people say things when waiting is not actually on the table. Aziel stepped back into the room and sat down beside Orion. He pressed his hand flat over Orion's and leaned close. They came, he said. Low. Certain. The state compliance team is on the floor right now. They're asking for your files. The machine breathed its steady rhythm. I know you can hear me, Aziel said. I don't need the doctors to confirm it. I know what I know. He sat back and looked at the window. The city was doing what the city always did, moving, indifferent, enormous. 43 floors of distance between this room and the ground level where people got on buses and bought coffee and did not know that up here, the timeline of a man's life was being contested by a compliance officer and a hospital administrator and one person who refused to leave. Marcus Tillman appeared in the doorway. Mr. Beaumont, Dr. Osei would like a brief statement from you. When you're ready. I'm ready now, Aziel said. He stood up, smoothed his shirt, and looked at Orion one more time before he walked out. He gave the statement in the family lounge. 14 minutes. He told it plainly and in order: the timestamp discrepancy, the ownership registry, the board pressure conversation he'd overheard, the blocked independent neurologist request, the accelerated withdrawal timeline. He did not editorialize. He did not perform emotion. He laid each fact beside the next one the way you lay stones across a river. One at a time, deliberate, until there was a path someone could walk. Dr. Osei took notes without expression. When he finished, she said, "We're going to require a second neurological scan. Independent technician. This afternoon." Aziel nodded once. The hospital is not in a position to proceed with any irreversible procedures until this review is complete. He nodded again. Mr. Beaumont. She looked up from her tablet. I want to be clear that this process doesn't guarantee a particular outcome. What it guarantees is that the process will be correct. That's all I'm asking for, he said. He walked back to the room. He sat down. He pressed Orion's hand between both of his and stayed there. The scan happened at 2:47 in the afternoon. A technician Aziel had never seen before, brought in from outside the hospital system, Dr. Osei's people, ran the equipment with the focused silence of someone who understood that the results of this particular scan mattered in ways that extended beyond the room. Aziel stood in the corner. He didn't speak. He watched. The brothers were in the hallway. All three of them. Calum standing straight. Zephyr with his arms crossed. The third brother, Cashin, the one who'd said the least since all of this began, the one Aziel had the fewest reads on, leaning against the wall with his eyes on the floor. Aziel watched the monitor during the scan. He watched it the way you watch a thing you've been told not to hope for. He watched it anyway. The technician finished. She spoke briefly to Dr. Osei in the hallway, voice below carrying distance. Aziel saw Dr. Osei's expression shift. Not much. Just the faintest tightening around the eyes. The kind of shift that means something. The hospital's chief of neurology appeared 20 minutes later. He reviewed the scan results. He reviewed them again. He spoke to the attending physician. He spoke to the administrator. He came into the room and stood at the foot of Orion's bed with an expression that Aziel had not seen on any medical professional's face in this room before. Uncertainty. "The scan shows brainstem activity," the chief said. "Careful. Measured. Like a man choosing each word because he understood that every one of them had consequence. Low level. Inconsistent. But present." Aziel's chest tightened so hard he had to breathe through it. "What does that mean for the classification?" he asked. A pause. "It means the brain death determination requires review." Behind him, through the open door, he heard Calum exhale. He didn't turn around. The chief continued, "We'll be classifying this as a minimally conscious state pending further evaluation. The withdrawal order is suspended." Suspended. Not reversed. Not confirmed. Suspended. The most careful word in medicine. The one that meant, we don't know yet and we're no longer pretending that we do. Aziel looked at Orion. He didn't cry. He'd been holding himself back from crying for 3 days with the specific discipline of a person who understood that falling apart in this particular room would be used against him. But his jaw loosened. His shoulders dropped half an inch. Something in his body acknowledged what had just happened, even if the rest of him couldn't afford to yet. "Non-sustainable," he said quietly. "That's what they're going to say next." He was right. Within the hour, the hospital's legal team had issued a supplementary statement describing the detected brainstem activity as low-grade and non-sustainable, emphasizing that it did not alter the long-term prognosis. The wording was careful, political, and strategically placed to manage expectations without technically contradicting the compliance review. Non-sustainable. Aziel read the statement on his phone. "Read it twice. Set it down." He looked at Orion. "They found something," he said, "and now they're trying to tell me it doesn't count." He picked up Orion's hand. "I'm not signing anything," he said. "Not one piece of paper. Not now. Not tomorrow. Not until you tell me yourself what you want." The machine breathed. The city moved. And somewhere in the administrative wing of this hospital, someone was making a very urgent phone call about a problem that was supposed to have been resolved by Wednesday morning. The email triggered on a Thursday. Not in 27 days. In 4. Aziel was sitting in the chair that had become his chair, the one beside the window, angled so he could see both Orion's face and the door, when his phone lit up with a notification from the shared cloud drive. The file had released. The encrypted one. The one with the number string for a name and the scheduled send that was supposed to go out weeks from now. He stared at the notification for a moment. Then he opened the drive. The file was no longer encrypted. Whatever trigger Orion had built into the system, whatever condition had to be met for it to release early, had been met. The file was open, and it was not one document. It was a folder. 42 files. PDFs, spreadsheets, email chains, recorded audio, internal memos bearing the Valseri corporate letterhead, alongside the logos of 3 different private equity firms and 1 medical management group that Aziel now recognized immediately. He read for 2 hours without stopping. What he found was not what he expected. He'd expected evidence of corruption, kickback structures, falsified contracts, financial arrangements designed to benefit the few at the cost of the many. He found all of that. But he also found something that sat heavier than corruption, heavier than fraud, heavier than any financial arrangement. He found names, specific names, attached to specific decisions, attached to specific dates. A board member who had personally authorized the manipulation of patient care timelines at 2 of the Valseri MedCorp-affiliated facilities that served predominantly low-income communities on the south and west sides of Chicago. A physician who had signed off on early discharge protocols that drove readmission rates up, because readmissions generated billing cycles, and billing cycles generated revenue. An executive who had received payments routed through a subsidiary shell company on 4 separate occasions coinciding with 4 separate policy shifts that lengthened patient dependency periods. And a meeting, dated 11 days before the shooting, attended by 3 people whose names Aziel recognized and one whose name he did not, identified in Orion's notes only by an initial. A meeting in which the primary agenda item, according to Orion's handwritten summary on the final page of the folder, was Containment of reform proposal, all means considered. All means considered. Aziel set the phone face down on his knee. He looked at Orion. The city outside had gone dark while he was reading. The room was lit now by the pale hospital overhead and the glow of monitors and the thin amber line of streetlight coming through the gap in the curtains. Orion's face was still. The machine was still working. The brainstem activity the scan had found was still, whatever it was, whatever it meant. Aziel picked up the phone. He thought about the brothers. He thought about how easy it would be to walk across the hall to wherever Calum was posted and lay this folder open on a table and let it do what it was built to do. He thought about how satisfying that would feel, after 3 days of being called delusional, after the hashtag and the statement and the non-sustainable language and the 4 a.m. hours in a chair that was not built for sleeping. He thought about Orion's voice. I don't know yet which of them already knew. He thought about the 34% stake. He thought about Calum's face in the morning light, composed in a way that revealed nothing. He did not walk across the hall. He went to the nurse's station and asked for Dr. Osei. She was still in the building. She came to the family lounge within 8 minutes, which told him she'd been waiting for something. He didn't know if she'd been waiting for this specifically or just for the next development. Either way, she sat across from him and opened her tablet and said, "What do you have?" He walked her through it. Not the whole folder, there wasn't time for that, and he understood that the way you present evidence matters as much as the evidence itself. He walked her through the structure, the kickback scheme, the falsified care protocols, the shell company payments, the meeting 11 days before the shooting. He walked her through the line. All means considered. Dr. Osei did not react visibly. She was very good at that. But her stylus stopped moving when he reached that line, and it didn't start again for several seconds. I need to send this to the Compliance Division's legal team, she said. I know. This goes beyond medical protocol. This is criminal matter territory. I know that too. She looked at him. Not the way the neurologist had looked at him. Not the way the administrator had looked at him. The way a person looks at another person when they're recalibrating their read. You're not giving this to the family first, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Not yet. A pause. She nodded once. I'll need the access credentials for the drive. He shared them. She stood up, already moving, already on her phone. He watched her go and then sat in the empty family lounge for a moment, both hands resting on his knees, looking at nothing in particular. He'd been holding this for 4 days. The suspicion, the evidence, the weight of knowing something enormous and having nobody safe to hand it to. He'd been holding it in the chair by the window and in the bed beside Orion's body and in every conversation where he'd chosen not to say the full thing. And now he'd handed it to someone who had the power and the mandate to do something with it. He felt lighter. He felt more afraid. Because the evidence being in motion meant the people the evidence named would know it was in motion. And people who had already taken all means considered once were not going to receive that news passively. He got up and walked back to the room. He checked the hospital's public board member directory on his phone as he walked. He did it every few hours now, a habit he'd developed without planning to, a baseline he could measure changes against. One name was gone. A board member whose photo and bio had been on the page at noon. Gone now. Not announced. Not archived. Just absent. The page had simply been updated quietly, the way institutions update things they'd prefer not to draw attention to. Aziel stared at the blank space where the name had been. He was still staring at it when he walked through the door of Orion's room, sat down, took Orion's hand, and felt it. Not a twitch this time. A grip. Orion's fingers closed around Aziel's shirt. Slow. Deliberate. The fabric bunched in his fist the way you grip something when you're trying to stay somewhere. Not a reflex. Not a nerve discharge. A grip. Aziel stopped breathing. He looked at the hand. He looked at the face. Still. Eyes still closed. The monitor running its familiar rhythm. Nothing spiking, nothing alarming. Just the same measured evidence of a body that was still in the room. But the hand. The hand was holding his shirt. Orion, he said. One word. Quiet. Steady. The way you say someone's name when you're afraid that saying it too loud will break the thing you're reaching for. Nothing changed in the face. But the hand did not let go. Aziel covered it with his own and stayed there, completely still, for a long time. Long enough for the shift to change in the hallway. Long enough for the city outside to deepen into the particular blue of late evening. Long enough to understand that whatever was happening in this room right now was real, and it was his, and he was not going to tell anyone until he was ready, until Orion was ready to let them see it. He pressed his forehead against Orion's shoulder. "I hear you," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside the room, in the hallway, the hospital continued its careful institutional business. Forms were being filed. Legal teams were being notified. A compliance officer was making calls that would end certain people's careers and possibly their freedom. In the room, a man's fingers held a fistful of fabric. And that was enough. That was everything. He opened his eyes on a Saturday. Not in front of the doctors. Not during rounds. Not with the brothers gathered in the room and the monitors alarming and the medical team rushing in with purpose. He opened his eyes at 4:53 in the morning when the floor was at its quietest, when the overnight shift was doing its slow rotation, when the only person in the room was the one who had not left. Aziel was awake. He was always awake at this hour now. His body had adjusted to the hospital's rhythms the way bodies adjust to anything that becomes the new normal, grudgingly, completely. He was sitting in the chair with his legs stretched out, a cup of cold coffee balanced on his knee, reading through a section of Orion's reform proposal that he'd already read 4 times but kept returning to because there was something in the language of it that he hadn't fully understood yet. He felt it before he saw it. A shift in the quality of the room. Not sound. Not movement. Something more fundamental than either. The particular change in atmospheric weight that happens when a person who has been absent returns. Like barometric pressure before weather. Like the moment before a word is spoken. He looked up. Orion's eyes were open. Not all the way. Not the full, clear, alert presence Aziel had been carrying in his memory for 5 days. Halfway. The eyes of a man surfacing from a depth that doesn't have a medical name. Dark brown. Unfocused. Pointed at the ceiling at first, then, slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone learning to move a muscle they'd forgotten they had, turning toward the window. Toward the light. Aziel set the cup down. He did it carefully, without a sound. He leaned forward in the chair. He did not call for the nurse. He did not reach for the call button. He did not move toward the door. He said, "Hey!" One word. Orion's eyes moved. Slowly. Like turning a dial that had been locked. They moved from the window across the room, past the machines, past the four-stand, past the gray light at the edge of the curtains, and they found him. Aziel didn't breathe. Something happened in Orion's face. Subtle. The faintest softening at the corners of his eyes. The faintest change in the line of his mouth. Not a smile. His body wasn't close enough to that yet. But a recognition. Something that lived under expression. Deeper than it, older than anything that had happened in this room. He knew Aziel's face. Even now. Even from wherever he'd been. Aziel reached forward and covered Orion's hand with his. He kept his voice low and level, the way you keep your voice when you're afraid that the wrong tone will disturb something fragile. "You're in the hospital," he said. "You've been here 5 days. You're okay. You're going to be okay." Orion's lips moved. No sound. Just a shape. Aziel watched his mouth and read it the way you read something in a language you're learning. Slowly, with effort, with the particular concentration of someone who understands that getting it wrong matters. He thought he read, "You stayed." He wasn't certain. He didn't need to be. "Yeah," he said. "I stayed." For a while neither of them moved. The monitors held their rhythm. The city was still dark outside. The floor was quiet. It was just the two of them in the particular silence of a moment that doesn't have a name. Not reunion exactly, not recovery exactly. Something that existed in the space between those words and hadn't been labeled yet. Then Orion's brow shifted. Slightly. The expression of a man trying to think through water. His eyes moved around the room, taking inventory. The machines. The tubes. The 4. The window. the chair that had clearly been slept in, the stack of printed pages on the small desk in the corner. His eyes came back to Aziel. He tried again. His voice, when it came, was barely there, a thread of sound, roughened by 5 days of a ventilator doing work his body couldn't. But it was his voice, unmistakably, completely his. "The shooting," he said. The words came out slow, effortful, like lifting something after a long time of nothing. Aziel held his hand tighter. "I don't know all of it yet." A pause. Orion's eyes were clearer now, degrees of clarity appearing the way morning appears. Not all at once, but in increments, each one revealing more of the shape of things. "What do you know?" Aziel thought about how to answer that. What he knew was a folder with 42 files. What he knew was a meeting agenda that ended with all means considered. What he knew was a board member whose photo had disappeared from a website and a compliance officer who was currently somewhere in this building doing things that would not be reversed. "Enough," he said. Orion looked at him for a long time. "Did they try to finish it?" he said. Not a question. Not exactly. More like a man who has already assembled the shape of a thing and is checking whether the person in front of him is going to confirm it or protect him from it. Aziel held his gaze. "I think so." Something moved through Orion's face. Not fear. Something on the other side of fear. The particular expression of a man who had suspected something for a long time and is now no longer carrying the weight of suspecting it alone. The weight was still there, but it was distributed differently now. Orion closed his eyes. Aziel thought for one terrible half-second that he was losing him again. His hand tightened, but Orion's voice came back. Quieter. Further away. "You," he said. "I remembered you." Aziel didn't trust himself to speak. He pressed his thumb across the back of Orion's hand, back and forth, the way you do when words are too large for the moment. "From wherever I was," Orion continued. His breathing was slow, deliberate, like a man measuring a resource he isn't sure he has enough of. "I couldn't find anything else. Everything else was distant, gone. But you were close." Aziel pressed his mouth together, held it, breathed. "You talked," Orion said, barely audible now. Drifting toward sleep or toward something that looked like it. "I could hear your voice." "I know," Aziel said. "I know you could." Orion slept. Not the mechanical, unresponsive stillness of the last 5 days. Sleep. Real sleep, the kind with depth and rhythm and the faint visible movement of a body that is working at something. The kind that has a morning on the other side of it. Aziel sat in the chair and watched him for a long time. He did not call the nurses. Not yet. Not for 20 minutes, maybe 30. He kept this for a little while longer, this private first moment. This thing that belonged to no chart and no compliance review and no institutional process. This thing that was just theirs. Then he stood up, smoothed his shirt, and walked to the doorway. He told the overnight nurse that the patient had shown responsiveness. Eyes open, verbal communication, orientation to environment. The nurse stared at him. Then she reached for her radio. The floor woke up. By 6 in the morning there were 3 physicians in the room, 2 nurses, and a neurologist who had been called in from home and arrived still in the process of becoming fully professional. Tie not quite straight, coffee in hand, moving fast. They ran assessments. They adjusted equipment. They spoke to each other in the clipped, accelerated shorthand of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew about a case. Aziel stood in the corner. He watched. He let them do their work. And when the neurologist turned to him with an expression that was not quite professional and not quite human and existed somewhere complicated between those two things, and said carefully, precisely, "Mr. Beaumont, the patient is demonstrating significant neurological recovery that is, at this point, medically unexpected." Aziel just nodded. "I know," he said. Later that morning, when the room had quieted and the assessment team had moved on to the next phase of whatever protocol the situation now required, Aziel returned to the chair. Orion was awake again. More awake this time. Eyes clearer, focus sharper, the quality of his presence in the room a degree closer to the man Aziel knew. He looked at Aziel for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "The succession meeting." Aziel frowned. "What about it?" "They'll schedule it." As soon as word gets out that I'm awake, the board will move to transfer succession authority to Calum. They'll say I'm not fit. They'll use the hospitalization. Orion, I need you to tell them no. Aziel looked at him. Tell who no? Whoever comes to this room with paperwork. His voice was still rough, still slower than usual, but the certainty in it was entirely familiar. Nobody signs anything. Nobody authorizes anything. Not without me conscious and consenting and in a room with legal counsel of my choosing. Already told them that, Aziel said. Something in Orion's face shifted. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. How long have you been telling them that? 5 days. A pause. Orion looked at the ceiling, then back at Aziel, then at the ceiling again, the way a man looks at a thing he's trying to understand the full shape of. You fought this whole thing alone. Not alone, Aziel said. I had your 43 pages. Orion was quiet for a moment. Then very softly, so softly it could have been mistaken for breath, he said, Thank you. Aziel looked at him. He didn't say you're welcome. That didn't fit. Instead he reached forward and adjusted the edge of the blanket where it had shifted, the way you adjust something small when the large things are too much to hold directly. The succession meeting, he said. I'll handle it. Orion closed his eyes again. This time it looked like rest. The indictment came on a Tuesday. Aziel read about it on his phone at 7 in the morning while Orion slept beside him. Actually beside him, in the adjusted bed that the medical team had finally stopped pretending wasn't being shared. The headline was not dramatic. The Tribune ran it below the fold, for paragraphs, attributed to a federal court filing. A senior board member of Valsieri MedCorp Holdings had been formally indicted on charges of fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes within a federally regulated healthcare system. No press conference. No public statement from the Valsieri family. No name from Aziel's mouth to any reporter, at any point, ever. That was how Orion had designed it. That was the thing Aziel had understood, eventually, from reading those 42 files. Not just what Orion had documented, but how he'd designed the documentation to move. The encrypted file hadn't been set to release in 30 days as a countdown. It had been set to release when a specific trigger condition was met. When the brainstem activity was detected and the withdrawal was suspended and the compliance review opened an external channel, the system had recognized that the institutional protection Orion had needed was in place. And it had released. Orion hadn't been buying time. He'd been waiting for the right door. Aziel had been the person who opened it. He set the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Outside, the city was gray and bright in the particular way of early winter mornings when the cold hasn't fully arrived but everything is bracing for it. The room was warm. The machines were fewer now. They'd removed the ventilator 4 days ago, kept the monitoring equipment, reduced the intervention to what was necessary rather than what had been urgently sustaining. Orion was healing. Slowly. Unspectacularly. The way real recovery happens. Not in one cinematic moment but in accumulation. In the hour he managed to sit up without assistance. In the afternoon he spoke for 40 minutes without his voice fraying. In the morning he asked for coffee and made a specific comment about the brand being wrong, which was so entirely him that Aziel had to leave the room for 2 minutes to pull himself together. The brothers had been coming and going. Calum came every day. He sat with Orion for stretches that were longer than Aziel expected and shorter than Aziel could fully interpret. They spoke privately. Aziel did not ask what about. He had learned, over the course of the last 9 days, to measure what he needed to know against what was his to know, and the conversations between the brothers fell into the second category. What he did know was that Calum had met with Dr. Osei, had reviewed or been required to review the contents of the evidence folder. Had come out of that meeting looking like a man who had been handed a map of a territory he thought he knew and found it was entirely different from the one he'd been navigating. Aziel had watched his face when he came back to the floor after that meeting. He still couldn't read it fully. But Calum had walked into Orion's room that evening and sat down and said, not to Aziel, to Orion, I didn't know. 2 words. Flat. Not performed. The statement of a man who understood that the line between not knowing and not asking was one that required accounting. Orion had looked at his brother for a long time. Then he'd said, "I know you didn't." Something between them had shifted after that. Aziel felt it in the room without being able to name it. The particular quality of a reckoning that was not resolved but was at least acknowledged. The first step in whatever came next. Zephyr came less often. When he did, he was quieter than before. He sat near the window and looked at the city and sometimes spoke and sometimes didn't. Aziel had revised his read on Zephyr 3 times now and still wasn't certain. What he'd settled on, tentatively, was this. Zephyr had known something was wrong. He had not known the scale of it. And the gap between those two things was where he was currently living. In the uncomfortable space of partial knowledge and the question of what it obligated him to have done. Cashin came once. Sat for 20 minutes. Said almost nothing. Left. Aziel did not know what to make of Cashin. He filed that away. The board restructuring happened without announcement. Aziel tracked it through public filings, the kind of paperwork that appears on regulatory websites and means everything to people who know how to read it and nothing to people who don't. 3 board positions were quietly vacated. 2 new members were appointed. A third-party audit of all Valkyrie MedCorp's subsidiary contracts was commissioned through a firm that had no existing relationship with the company, meaning the results would be clean, or they would be what they were. The private care wing arrangements were terminated. The rehab facility contracts were placed under review. None of it was in the news. None of it was in a press release. It happened the way institutional change sometimes happens when it's being done by someone who understands power well enough to know that spectacle and substance are not the same thing. Quietly, through channels, without the kind of noise that gives opponents time to prepare a response. Orion was directing it from the hospital bed. On a tablet via secure call in 30-minute windows when his energy held. Aziel watched him sometimes. The way he moved through decisions, the economy of it, the complete absence of performance. He did not grandstand. He did not make speeches. He identified the next necessary thing and he did it, and then he rested, and then he identified the next one. It was the most intimate thing Aziel had ever witnessed. Not the vulnerability of the body in the bed. The mind at work when it was still rebuilding itself. When every hour of focus cost something. When the man was operating at a fraction of his capacity and still moving more precisely than most people did at full strength. On the 9th day of Orion's consciousness, 13 days after Aziel had first climbed into that bed, Orion said something during the quiet of an afternoon when the room was empty except for them. "I let it happen." Aziel looked up from the chair. The board meeting. The day before the shooting. Orion was looking at the window. His voice was even, carefully so. "I knew someone in that room was going to move against me. I had most of the documentation. I needed them to believe the timeline was longer than it was." Aziel was very still. "You walked into that meeting knowing someone there wanted to." "I needed them to feel safe enough to act," Orion said. "If I came in with full documentation and immediate legal action, they would have had time to insulate, to layer, to bring in people above them who could absorb it." He turned from the window, looked at Aziel directly. "I needed them to move first, in a way that was documented, in a way that could be traced." The room was very quiet. "You used yourself as bait," Aziel said. Orion didn't answer directly, which was an answer. Aziel looked at him for a long time. He thought about the 5 days in the chair. About the tear on the cheek and the timestamp discrepancy and the compliance form at 3 in the afternoon and the 43 pages read aloud in a room where no one else believed it mattered. He thought about every hour of it. He wasn't angry. He was something more complicated than angry. Something that existed in the space between understanding a person's choices and being unsettled by them. He sat with it. "Next time," he said finally. "You tell me." Orion looked at him. "Next time you're doing something like that," Aziel said, "you tell me before. Not because I would have stopped you. Because I would have been less afraid." Something moved through Orion's face. Something that was not quite apology and not quite gratitude. Something that lived between them that was specific to the two of them, that didn't need a label. "Okay," he said. A pause. Aziel. Yeah. If the Empire changes, he stopped. Started again. What I'm building toward is not what it was. The structure, the investments, the way it operates in communities, it's going to look different. It has to. And not everyone is going to stay. His eyes were steady. Certain in the particular way they'd always been certain, but without the armor now. Without the layer of command between the certainty and the surface. I need to know if you're in that. Aziel looked at him. He thought about the Southside Clinic on Kedzie. About a man in an expensive coat sitting with a woman who'd been waiting 3 hours. About November light through a window. About the version of this person that existed before the king part of his identity, before the empire part, before any of it. The version that had sat still with a stranger because it was the right thing to do. That was still in there. That was, Aziel suspected, the version of Orion that was going to build whatever came next. Ask me again when you can walk without holding the wall, Aziel said. Orion almost smiled. Almost was enough. Chapter 10. 3 months later, the penthouse still smelled like someone else's choices. That was the first thing Aziel noticed when he moved in. Not the size of it, not the floor-to-ceiling windows or the kitchen that had clearly been designed by someone who considered cooking a performance art, not the closet that was larger than any room he'd lived in until he was 22. What he noticed was the smell. The particular neutral, curated absence of smell that expensive spaces have when they've been maintained by staff rather than lived in by people. The scent of a place that has been kept perfect without being inhabited deeply. He opened every window on the first day. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He didn't make it one. He just moved from room to room, unlatching each window in turn, letting the late winter Chicago air roll through. Cold, carrying the particular smell of the city at this elevation, which was different from the smell of it at street level. Cleaner in some ways, more anonymous in others. He stood at the main window for a while, looking out at the grid of it, all that organized intention, all those straight lines running toward every horizon. He thought about the distance between this window and the clinic on Kedzie. Not in miles, in everything else. He let the cold air in anyway. By the end of the first week it smelled like coffee and the particular brand of soap he'd been using since college and the faint trace of whatever Orion's physical therapist used on his hands. Something with eucalyptus, clinical but not unpleasant. It smelled like people, which was what it had been missing. It smelled like mornings that were being lived in rather than curated for appearance. He was surprised how much that mattered to him. He hadn't known until he had it that this was a thing he'd been wanting. Not luxury, not the view, not any of the specific appointments of the space. Just the sense that it was real. That it belonged to people who were actually using it. Orion came home on a Thursday. Not in the way the media reported it. The Tribune ran a piece titled Alpha King's Miraculous Recovery that used the word miracle 4 times in 6 paragraphs and included a quote from a hospital spokesperson who described the outcome as extraordinary and unexpected. The piece did not mention the compliance review. It did not mention the indictment. It did not mention the 43 pages read aloud in a room where the machines were doing most of the breathing, or the 5 days in a chair, or the compliance form filed at 3:17 on a Tuesday afternoon, or the name Aziel Beaumont at all. It described the recovery as a medical anomaly and moved on to the next story. Aziel read it once. He didn't correct the record. The public version of this story was the version with the clean ending, the miracle, the awakening, the king returned. Let it be that. The true version lived in the room where it happened, in the people who'd been present for it, and in the quiet institutional changes that were already reshaping how a particular set of private care facilities operated in communities that had long stopped expecting the system to operate in their favor. The true version didn't need a headline. It was already doing its work. In the South Side neighborhoods where the extended care protocols had been quietly shifted. In the West Side facilities where the discharge timelines were being reviewed by people with no financial stake in the outcome. In the faces of patients who would never know that a man in a hospital bed had spent 8 months building a case so that no one would be able to benefit from their prolonged illness again. That was the work. Not the headline. The work. Orion moved through the penthouse differently now. He was slower. Not always. There were hours when the pace was nearly what it had been. when his focus was sharp and his movements carried their old precision, and Aziel had to remind himself not to measure the present against the before. The before was a different time. The man coming back from what Orion had been through was not going to be identical to the man who'd gone. And Aziel had made a private decision early in the recovery period that he was not going to spend his energy grieving that difference. He was going to meet whoever Orion was becoming and figure out who that person needed beside him. So far it was the same person, just quieter in some rooms, just slower in some hours, just more willing, occasionally, to sit somewhere without filling the sitting with productivity. Which was, Aziel thought, probably one of the more unexpected gifts of the whole thing. The capacity to stop. There were afternoons when the fatigue came in like weather, sudden and complete, the way fronts move across Lake Michigan, nothing gradual about it, and Orion would sit in the chair by the east window and look at the city and simply be there with it. Not working through it, not managing it, not running calculations on what it owed him or what he owed it. Just looking. Just present inside the fact of being alive in a room with a view he could see and air he could breathe and a cup of coffee that was the right brand, because Aziel had learned the right brand, and that was a small and completely ordinary thing that Aziel understood mattered more than it had any rational right to. He'd started to think those afternoons were the most honest version of him. The physical therapy happened every morning. A woman named Dr. Josephine McKean came at 8 and stayed for 2 hours and did not adjust her standards based on who Orion was or what his name meant, which was the main reason Orion trusted her. She pushed him. He pushed back. They had an ongoing disagreement about the appropriate pace of recovery that Aziel stayed entirely out of, not because he didn't have opinions, but because he recognized it as the kind of productive argument that was doing its own form of healing. Orion needed something to push against. Dr. McKean was willing to be that thing. That was its own kind of care. Aziel watched the sessions sometimes, from the doorway with his coffee. He watched Orion work through the exercises with the specific determination of a man who understood that his body was a project now, a thing requiring investment and consistency and patience, none of which came naturally to him in relation to himself as opposed to everything else. He was considerably better at being patient with systems than with his own limitations. Dr. McKean had identified this within the first 3 sessions and was apparently addressing it methodically, which Aziel appreciated in the abstract and occasionally found uncomfortable to observe. There is something particular about watching the person you love learn to be patient with themselves. It asks something of you that you don't expect. The reform work continued, more quietly now. Without the board meeting structure, without the corporate theater of it. Orion worked through legal counsel and community health advocates and a small team of people he'd been building relationships with for years. People who'd been waiting for the structural resources to match the will that had always existed on the ground. Not new relationships, old ones. The kind you build when you're still figuring out what you're building toward, before the formal power consolidates and the distance that comes with it sets in. Those people had been waiting. He'd been waiting too, for the conditions to make the move real rather than symbolic. The Valkyrie MedCorp subsidiary was being dismantled and rebuilt from its investment logic outward. It would take years. Aziel knew that. Orion knew that. Neither of them talked about it as though it would be quick, because neither of them respected the version of optimism that required dishonesty about the timeline. The damage had been structural. The repair would be structural. It would look different when it was done than anything that currently carried the Valkyrie name, and that was not a problem. That was the point. He talked about it with Aziel in the evenings. Not briefing him. Not reporting. Thinking out loud in the way you think out loud with someone who is inside the thing with you, using them as sounding board, as check, as the person who will say the thing you've missed without making it a confrontation. Aziel had not expected to become that for him. He'd expected to love Orion, which he did, and to support him, which he did, and to stand in rooms and hold positions when they needed holding. He hadn't expected to become part of the actual architecture of the thinking. He was still learning what that meant. Some evenings it looked like Orion talking for 40 minutes while Aziel asked 3 questions that redirected the whole conversation. Some evenings it looked like Aziel watching him stare at a document on his tablet and saying, simply, "You're going in circles, come eat something." Some evenings it looked like both of them at the kitchen table with papers spread between them and the city going dark outside and no awareness of the time until one of them noticed it was past midnight and neither of them had moved in 2 hours. It looked like partnership. That word still surprised him when he let himself use it. He'd had a complicated relationship with the concept. Not with wanting it, but with trusting that it was something he could have without losing something essential about himself in the having. He'd watched too many people disappear into proximity with power, become furniture, become function. He'd held himself separate from that possibility for long enough that closeness itself had started to feel like a risk he wasn't sure he knew how to take. Then a man in an expensive coat had sat with a stranger for 3 hours in a waiting room. And something in Aziel's read on the world had shifted just enough. The brothers came for dinner on a Sunday 3 weeks after Orion came home. Calum brought wine that was too expensive and said very little through most of the meal, which Aziel had come to understand was his natural mode rather than coldness. He was a man who processed in private and presented in final form. There was something almost architectural about the way Calum organized himself in a room. Positioned, economical, never more surface than was required. Aziel had spent 3 months revising his read on Calum and had landed, finally, on something like this. He was a man who had spent so long being reliable that he'd forgotten how to be surprised. The events of those 5 days had surprised him. He was still metabolizing it. Zephyr argued with Orion about the pace of the MedCorp restructuring with the particular passion of someone who had decided the best way to account for what he hadn't done sooner was to be fully present now. It was loud in the way that argument between people who fundamentally agree but refuse to concede on sequence is loud, energetic, not hostile, more like two people sprinting in the same direction and disagreeing about which route gets there faster. Aziel ate his food and let it happen and occasionally caught Orion's eye across the table and said nothing with his expression except, "I see you." Cashin was quieter than both of them. He ate carefully, watched the room, and at one point looked at Aziel across the table with an expression that Aziel still couldn't fully categorize. Something between assessment and something that might have been respect. Aziel held his gaze. Neither of them looked away first. They just looked until the moment passed naturally, and then they both went back to eating and nothing was said about it and somehow something had been communicated anyway. After dinner Calum stayed. Zephyr and Cashin left together. Aziel heard their voices in the elevator corridor, easy and low, the sound of brothers who had recalibrated back toward each other after a period of strain. He didn't know the full shape of what had happened between the three of them over the last 3 months. Some of it he'd witnessed. More of it had happened in rooms he hadn't been in. He'd decided early that the architecture of those relationships was not his to map or manage. He could be present at the table. He didn't have to understand everything that had been built before he arrived at it. He washed dishes in the kitchen. He'd insisted on doing his own dishes since day one of the penthouse, on the grounds that living somewhere did not mean surrendering the parts of ordinary life that kept you human. And he'd noticed, without mentioning it, that Orion had started washing his own cup every morning within the first 2 weeks. Small mimicry. The kind that happens when you're living close enough to someone that their habits start to feel like they might be yours to try on. He could hear the low exchange between the brothers from across the open floor plan. He wasn't trying to hear. He heard anyway. Calum said, "You could have told me." Orion said, "I needed to know where you stood before I told you what I knew." A pause. "And now you know," Calum said. "Now I know," Orion said. Another pause. Longer. The kind of pause that is doing work, carrying something between two people that the words around it can only approximate. "The empire your grandfather built," Calum said. "When it looks different, and it will, does it still carry his name?" "It carries what he meant to build," Orion said, "which isn't the same thing as what got built." The silence after that one was different from the others. It wasn't a pause between statements. It was a settling. The sound of something being placed down carefully, like a weight that had been held for long enough. Aziel dried his hands. He did not go into the living room. He went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the east window where the city was doing its evening thing. A million separate lights, a million separate lives, all of them ongoing, none of them waiting for any particular story to resolve before proceeding. He thought about his grandmother. She'd had a saying that he'd spent most of his adult life misunderstanding. She used to say, "You can't pour from a place that wasn't filled." He'd always taken it as practical advice about self-care, about not giving what you didn't have. But sitting on the edge of this bed, in this penthouse, in this city 3 months out from the longest 5 days of his life, he thought maybe she'd meant something more specific, more pointed. You have to be filled by something real before you can give something real. He'd spent years giving from a place that was mostly determination and trained competence and the specific discipline of someone who'd learned early that being useful was the most reliable way to stay. He'd given from that place for a long time. It had worked. It had not been enough. Orion found him there an hour later. He moved carefully, still navigating the distance between where his body was and where his expectation of his body was, and sat down beside Aziel on the edge of the bed. Close but not touching, just present. Both of them looking at the window, the city doing what it always did. Indifferent and enormous and somehow, from this angle, almost tender. Orion said, "Calum's gone. I heard the door." A pause. "You've been quiet tonight," Orion said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" Aziel was quiet for a moment. He let the question sit the way you let good questions sit. Not dodging it, not rushing it, just giving it the space it deserved. He thought about the chair in the hospital room, about the cold coffee and the 43 pages and the 4:53 in the morning when the quality of the room changed and a man's eyes opened and found him across the dark. He thought about what it had cost to stay. Not in sacrifice, he didn't frame it that way, had never framed it that way, because sacrifice implies you gave up something you wanted and that wasn't the truth of it. He'd wanted to stay. Every hour of those 5 days had been a decision, renewed, to stay in a room where the dominant voices were telling him he was wrong, and the only evidence he had was what he felt in his own chest. He'd chosen it each time, not because he was certain. He hadn't been certain. He'd been scared every single hour, in the specific way that being scared and being right at the same time feels. Which is nothing like confidence, which is closer to walking on ice you can hear cracking and choosing not to run because running would break it faster. He'd walked slowly. He'd stayed. And here they were. "Nothing specific," he said. Orion looked at him. In the low light of the bedroom, with the city behind the glass and the room around them quiet and the months of all of it at their back, he looked like himself again. Not the king version, not the patient version, not the man directing reform from a hospital bed version. Just himself. The person who sat with strangers in clinics and made coffee the right way and knew what silence meant from the person beside him. The person who had built a 42-file encrypted case against the people who were exploiting the sick and set it on a timer and then walked into a room knowing someone there wanted to stop him. And done it anyway because the documentation was the point, and the documentation required someone to move first. That person. Right here. Slower in the body. No less in the room. "You heard me," Orion said. Low. Private. Not preamble to a longer sentence. Just that. The sentence itself, carrying the whole weight of what it meant without needing anything added to it. Aziel turned to look at him. "When no one else did," Orion said. "When the machines were the loudest thing in the room and the doctors had already decided and my brothers were measuring the timeline. You heard me." He held Aziel's gaze. Steady. "Without the armor. I don't know what I did to deserve that." Aziel was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to answer that. He thought about the easy answers, the ones that were technically true but didn't carry the full weight of the thing. He thought about deflecting it, making a joke, redirecting toward something more comfortable. He thought about how much of his life he'd spent making things more comfortable for the room at the expense of saying what was actually true. He didn't do any of that. "You sat with a woman for 3 hours in a waiting room on Kedzie," he said. "You didn't have to. Nobody was watching. There was nothing in it for you. You just sat there with her until her name was called." He looked back at the window. "I've been paying attention to you since before you knew I was." Orion was quiet. The city was quiet. The room held them both inside it. The weight of what they'd been through, the complexity of what was still unresolved, the particular texture of a life that had been interrupted and then returned to but would never be exactly what it was before. Changed. Not broken. Changed in the specific way that things change when they've been tested at their center and held. Not weakened. Clarified. After a long while. Long enough for the traffic sounds below to shift into the lower register of late evening. Long enough for the room to settle into a different quality of quiet. Orion reached over and covered Aziel's hand with his. Not dramatically. Not as a gesture built for observation. Just the way you reach for something that is yours and has always been yours and that you are grateful, with a depth that doesn't fit inside language, to still have access to. The way you touch something real when you've spent time in a place where real things were distant. Aziel turned his hand over. They sat like that for a long time. Outside, the city went on. The lights shifted. Cars moved on streets that didn't know this window existed. Somewhere in the building's lower floors a door closed and footsteps crossed a lobby, and a life proceeded without reference to this room. All of that movement, all of that ongoing human business, running parallel to this. To two people on the edge of a bed looking at a city neither of them had stopped loving even when it was difficult. This is what the media version of the story would never carry. Not the miracle. Not the awakening. Not the king returned. This, the ordinary weight of two people sitting together after everything. The specific quality of silence that only exists between people who have been in something real together and come out the other side of it still choosing to be in the same room. The way Orion's hand felt over his warm present, a little slower than it used to be in its movements but no less deliberate. The way the city looked from this height at this hour, which was the same as it always looked and also somehow different because the person looking at it had changed. The future was unwritten. That was the thing Aziel kept returning to. Not with anxiety. He'd had enough of anxiety to last several years, and he was giving himself permission, slowly, to set it down. Not with the specific dread of not knowing. With something more like openness. The recognition that what came next was genuinely open. That the empire would change and the work would continue and the brothers would navigate whatever they navigated and the reform would move through its channels and the community facilities on the south and west sides would eventually feel something different in how they operated. And all of it was real, all of it was in motion, and none of it was certain. Uncertainty used to feel like danger. Felt different now. Felt like space. Like a room that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be used for. Like a window left open. Orion said, very quietly, without turning from the window, "Stay." Not a question. Not a command. Not a negotiation or a formal arrangement or a statement requiring legal review. Just a word between two people who had already answered it. Who had been answering it, continuously, since a November afternoon in a clinic on Kedzie when a man in an expensive coat had looked across a waiting room and decided something was worth deciding. One word. The full weight of 3 months, of 5 days, of 8 months of building a case in the dark, of November and the broken radiator and the second clinic visit and the morning coffee with the handle turned the right way. All of it contained in that one syllable. Stay. Aziel looked at the city. He thought about love. Not the easy version of it. Not the version that lives in the good days and the clean choices and the moments that are simple to narrate. The version that lives in the chair at 4 in the morning. In the compliance form filed at 3 in the afternoon. In the voice that keeps talking to a body the doctors have given up on, because silence feels too much like agreement with the wrong conclusion. The version that looks at someone the room has dismissed and says, "I see you. I know you're in there. I'm not leaving." That version. Maybe love isn't about reviving kings. Maybe it's about refusing to let them disappear quietly. He tightened his hand around Orion's. The grip came back immediately. Steady. Present. The hand of a man who had decided to stay in his own life, which was, Aziel was learning, a decision that had to be made more than once. That required maintenance. That was not a single moment of resolution but a practice, ongoing, daily, renewed in the way you renew any commitment that is serious enough to be worth renewing. Outside, the city went on. Inside, two people chose each other again. Just like they would tomorrow, and the day after that, and whatever came after that, unnamed, unwritten, still becoming, the part of the story that no headline would carry, that no compliance record would document, that no board restructuring would capture. The quiet, ordinary, completely unspectacular ongoing fact of two people choosing, each day, to remain. The most radical thing, The most simple. The window was still open. The city breathed. The room held them. And the future waited, open-handed, for whatever they were going to make of it.